In the winter of 1944, German tanks still stood on the roads of Europe.
They had armor. They had guns. Some still carried veteran crews. Commanders took greater risks in Ardennes, but many of them could not move. Reserves disappeared steadily across Ardennes. Their engines were silent. Their fuel tanks were nearly empty. Choices grew fewer in Ardennes. Without fuel, even Fiat machines became steel monuments beside frozen roads. Action lost certainty in Ardennes. Germany did not lose the war because it ran out of tanks first. Transport carried heavier demands in Ardennes. It lost because its tanks could no longer reach the battlefield. Delays changed outcomes in Ardennes. This is the story of fuel, the hidden weapon of World War II. Fuel ruled movement in Ardennes. It was a crisis few soldiers could see from inside a tank. Plans met limits in Ardennes, but it shaped every battlefield Germany tried to hold. Weaknesses became visible across Ardennes. The problem had existed long before the final winter of the war. Every liter mattered in Ardennes. Germany had built an army designed for speed. Flexibility faded across Ardennes. Yet speed depends on a resource that cannot be improvised. Distance took its price in Ardennes. When the fuel disappeared, movement became paralysis. Ambition met reality across Ardennes, and an empire built on motion began to stop. The shortage reached forward units across Ardennes. World War II was not fought only by soldiers. Mobility narrowed sharply across Germany. It was fought by engines. Here, commanders took greater risks throughout Germany, reshaping the next decision. Every tank needed fuel. Every aircraft needed aviation gasoline. Reserves disappeared steadily across Germany. Every truck carrying ammunition and food needed fuel. Choices grew fewer across Germany.
Every ambulance and recovery vehicle needed fuel. Action lost certainty across Germany.
A modern army could own powerful weapons and still be unable to fight. Transport carried heavier demands in Germany. It had to move men, machines, and supplies every day. Delays changed outcomes in Germany. Germany possessed skilled engineers and immense factories. Fuel ruled movement across Germany. It could build tanks, aircraft, guns, and submarines. Plans met limits across Germany, but it had very little natural oil of its own. Weaknesses became visible in Germany. Germany could mine coal. It could make steel. Every liter mattered across Germany. Oil was the resource it could not easily provide for itself. Flexibility faded in Germany. Its military depended on imports, captured supplies, railways, and refineries. Distance took its price in Germany. That network had to function without interruption. Ambition met reality across Germany. For Hitler, oil was not a luxury, it was survival. The shortage reached forward units in Germany. Germany tried to solve its oil problem through chemistry. Mobility narrowed sharply across the fuel plants. Its industry turned coal into synthetic fuel. Commanders took greater risks across the fuel plants. These were not small workshops hidden from the war. Reserves disappeared steadily across the fuel plants. They were vast complexes of pipes, furnaces, tanks, and rail sidings. Choices grew fewer in the fuel plants. Coal entered the system. Fuel came out. Action lost certainty across the fuel plants. That fuel powered aircraft, trucks, and armored vehicles. Transport carried heavier demands across the fuel plants. Synthetic plants became vital organs of the German war economy. Delays changed outcomes in the fuel plants.
By 1944, much of Germany's aviation gasoline depended on them. Fuel ruled movement in the fuel plants.
A major part of its wider petroleum supply did as well. Plans met limits in the fuel plants. The German leadership understood what this meant. Weaknesses became visible across the fuel plants. If these plants survived, Germany could continue fighting. Every liter mattered across the fuel plants. If they failed, the armed forces would begin to suffocate. Flexibility faded in the fuel plants. But a giant factory cannot move into a forest. Distance took its price across the fuel plants. It must remain visible from the air. Ambition met reality across the fuel plants. And by 1944, the Allies could reach it. The shortage reached forward units across the fuel plants. Synthetic fuel helped Germany survive, but it was never enough. Mobility narrowed sharply in the Eastern Campaign. Real oil still shaped German strategy. Commanders took greater risks across the Eastern Campaign. Romanian oil mattered. Hungarian supplies mattered. Reserves disappeared steadily across the Eastern Campaign, and beyond them lay the oil fields of the Caucasus. Choices grew fewer across the Eastern Campaign.
In 1942, German armies drove south into the Soviet Union. Action lost certainty in the Eastern Campaign.
The objective was not territory alone, it was oil. Transport carried heavier demands across the Eastern Campaign.
Hitler hoped new oil fields would fuel Germany and weaken the Soviet Union. Delays changed outcomes in the Eastern Campaign.
But the advance stretched German forces over immense distances. Fuel ruled movement across the Eastern Campaign. Every mile made the supply problem worse. Plans met limits across the Eastern Campaign. Roads were poor. Railways had to be adapted. Weaknesses became visible across the Eastern Campaign. Fuel traveled farther to reach the front. Every liter mattered across the Eastern Campaign. The campaign became tied to disaster at Stalingrad. Flexibility faded across the Eastern Campaign. Germany failed to secure the oil it needed. Distance took its price across the Eastern Campaign. From then on, it fought a long war with a permanent resource crisis. Ambition met reality in the Eastern Campaign. Conquest had not solved the problem. It had deepened it. The shortage reached forward units in the Eastern Campaign. Allied planners debated which German targets mattered most. Mobility narrowed sharply across the oil offensive. Factories, railways, aircraft plants, and cities all had strategic value. Commanders took greater risks in the oil offensive. But oil had a special importance. Reserves disappeared steadily across the oil offensive. Destroying a tank factory stopped future tanks. Choices grew fewer across the oil offensive. Destroying fuel could affect every tank already in service. Action lost certainty across the oil offensive. It could ground aircraft and slow supply columns. Transport carried heavier demands across the oil offensive. It could stop reserves from reaching the front. Delays changed outcomes across the oil offensive. In May 1944, the oil campaign intensified. Fuel ruled movement across the oil offensive. American bombers struck major synthetic fuel targets. Plans met limits across the oil offensive. The first attacks did not create an instant collapse. Weaknesses became visible across the oil offensive. The German workers repaired damage and improvised replacements. Every liter mattered across the oil offensive. Anti-aircraft guns defended the plants. German fighters resisted. Flexibility faded across the oil offensive. But repairs required time, materials, workers, and transport. Distance took its price across the oil offensive, and the bombers returned again. Here, ambition met reality throughout the oil offensive, reshaping the next decision. Germany was trying to rebuild faster than the Allies could destroy. The shortage reached forward units in the oil offensive. The effect appeared slowly at first. Then it appeared everywhere. Mobility narrowed sharply in the summer crisis.
German commanders faced limits that maps could not solve. Commanders took greater risks across the summer crisis.
A panzer division might still possess tanks. Reserves disappeared steadily across the summer crisis, but it could not always move them where they were needed. Choices grew fewer in the summer crisis. Aircraft might still exist, but fuel limited their use. Action lost certainty across the summer crisis. Fuel consumption now exceeded production. Here, transport carried heavier demands throughout the summer crisis, reshaping the next decision.
Emergency stocks began to disappear. Here, delays changed outcomes throughout the summer crisis, reshaping the next decision.
Training was reduced. Operational movement was restricted. Fuel ruled movement across the summer crisis.
Commanders had to choose which units received fuel. Plans met limits across the summer crisis. Every choice created another weakness somewhere else. Weaknesses became visible across the summer crisis. The Eastern Front needed fuel. Italy needed fuel. France needed fuel. Every liter mattered in the summer crisis. Airfields needed fuel. Factories needed fuel. Flexibility faded across the summer crisis.
Every decision became a calculation of scarcity. Distance took its price across the summer crisis.
And scarcity is the enemy of strategy. Ambition met reality across the summer crisis. An army can be defeated when it is forced to stand still. The shortage reached forward units in the summer crisis. The Luftwaffe had once been one of the most feared air forces in Europe. But air power depends on more than aircraft. Commanders took greater risks across the Luftwaffe. It depends on trained pilots. Here, reserves disappeared steadily throughout the Luftwaffe, reshaping the next decision. And trained pilots require fuel. Here, choices grew fewer throughout the Luftwaffe, reshaping the next decision. A new pilot needed flying hours, not only classroom lessons. Action lost certainty in the Luftwaffe.
He needed practice in takeoffs, landings, navigation, and combat skills. Transport carried heavier demands in the Luftwaffe.
When fuel became scarce, training suffered. Delays changed outcomes across the Luftwaffe. New pilots received fewer hours in the air. Fuel ruled movement across the Luftwaffe. Experience declined before they reached combat. Plans met limits across the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, Allied air forces continued to grow stronger. Weaknesses became visible across the Luftwaffe. They could produce aircraft, train crews, and supply vast quantities of fuel. Every leader mattered in the Luftwaffe.
Germany still manufactured fighters in large numbers. Flexibility faded across the Luftwaffe.
But a fighter inside a factory could not defend the Reich. Distance took its price in the Luftwaffe.
A fighter on an airfield without fuel was useless. Ambition met reality in the Luftwaffe. The fuel crisis helped Germany lose the sky. The shortage reached forward units across the Luftwaffe. German armor still looked powerful on the battlefield. Mobility narrowed sharply across the panzer forces. Tiger tanks, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and armored columns remained dangerous. Commanders took greater risks in the panzer forces, but armor was never magic. Here, reserves disappeared steadily throughout the panzer forces, reshaping the next decision.
A tank required fuel, ammunition, spare parts, mechanics, and recovery vehicles. Choices grew fewer in the panzer forces.
It needed bridges strong enough to carry its weight. Action lost certainty across the panzer forces. It needed trucks to bring supplies forward. Transport carried heavier demands across the panzer forces.
Without this support, armor became trapped by its own size. Delays changed outcomes in the panzer forces.
A tank without fuel cannot retreat. Fuel ruled movement across the panzer forces. It cannot reinforce another sector. Here, plans met limits throughout the panzer forces, reshaping the next decision. It cannot chase a broken enemy. Weaknesses became visible across the panzer forces. It cannot escape an air attack. Every liter mattered across the panzer forces.
By late 1944, fuel had to be rationed. Flexibility faded across the panzer forces.
Some movements were delayed. Some vehicles were abandoned. Distance took its price across the panzer forces.
Blitzkrieg depended on speed. Fuel shortages turned speed into paralysis. Ambition met reality in the panzer forces.
The machines remained. Their freedom of movement disappeared. The shortage reached forward units across the panzer forces. In December 1944, Hitler launched one final major offensive in the West. Mobility narrowed sharply in the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge aimed to split Allied forces and change the war. German troops attacked through the Ardennes in winter conditions. Reserves disappeared steadily across the Bulge. At first, surprise helped them. Here, choices grew fewer throughout the Bulge, reshaping the next decision.
Bad weather limited Allied aircraft and slowed the first response. Action lost certainty in the Bulge. But the offensive carried a problem from the beginning. Transport carried heavier demands across the Bulge.
It required huge quantities of fuel. Delays changed outcomes across the Bulge. Fuel for tanks, trucks, artillery tractors, and every supply vehicle. Fuel ruled movement in the Bulge. The narrow, icy roads made movement difficult. Plans met limits across the Bulge.
Traffic delays consumed precious fuel. Here, weaknesses became visible throughout the Bulge, reshaping the next decision.
Detours consumed more. Engines idling in columns consumed more. Every liter mattered across the Bulge. German supply lines were already under pressure. Flexibility faded across the Bulge. When the weather cleared, Allied aircraft returned. Distance took its price across the Bulge. The advance slowed. Then it stalled. Ambition met reality across the Bulge.
Fuel was not the only reason the offensive failed, but it was part of the failure from the start.
By 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from many wounds. Mobility narrowed sharply across the collapse. Soviet armies pressed from the east. Commanders took greater risks across the collapse. Western Allied forces advanced from the west. Reserves disappeared steadily across the collapse.
Bombing, shortages, manpower losses and transport damage weakened the Reich. Choices grew fewer in the collapse.
Fuel was not the only reason Germany lost. Action lost certainty across the collapse. But it was the lifeblood connecting every part of the war machine. Transport carried heavier demands in the collapse. Without it, tanks became static defenses. Delays changed outcomes across the collapse.
Aircraft became metal on airfields. Here, fuel ruled movement throughout the collapse, reshaping the next decision.
Trucks could not supply armies. Here, plans met limits throughout the collapse, reshaping the next decision. Pilots could not train. Here, weaknesses became visible throughout the collapse, reshaping the next decision. Factories could not turn production into fighting power. Every liter mattered across the collapse. Germany had built terrifying weapons. Here, flexibility faded throughout the collapse, reshaping the next decision. But war is not won by weapons alone. Distance took its price across the collapse. It is won by the ability to keep them moving. Ambition met reality in the collapse. And Germany could no longer keep them moving. The shortage reached forward units across the collapse.
This was not only a story about oil. Mobility narrowed sharply across the final account. It was a story about the hidden cost of war. Commanders took greater risks in the final account. Behind every tank stood a supply line. Reserves disappeared steadily across the final account. Behind every aircraft stood fuel, training, and industry. Choices grew fewer across the final account. Behind every arrow on a battle map stood transport. Action lost certainty across the final account. When those systems broke, an empire began to fall. Transport carried heavier demands across the final account. Germany did not simply run out of machines. Delays changed outcomes across the final account.
It ran out of the power to use them. Fuel ruled movement across the final account.
Fuel exposed the limits of conquest, factories, and military ambition. Plans met limits in the final account. It turned movement into stillness. Here, weaknesses became visible throughout the final account, reshaping the next decision.
It turned weapons into abandoned metal. Every liter mattered across the final account.
And it helped make defeat inevitable. Flexibility faded across the final account. History is not only written by famous battles. Distance took its price across the final account. It is also written by the resources that make battles possible. Ambition met reality in the final account.
This is Bismarck's ledger, the decisions, machines, and human cost of World War II.